Expand your horizons with BBC Knowledge.
Here at the Imperial War Museum in South London, in the luxury of peacetime, thousands of people come to absorb the horror, the impact, and it has to be said, admire the hardware of war. The paraphernalia of conflict can recreate ghosts from the past and give a vivid flavour of what life must have been like on the Western Front or in Vietnam. But there's another way the experiences of war have been made real for us.
What passing bells for these who die as cattle? Only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries now for them, no prayers nor bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wailing shells, and bugles calling them from sad shires.
Much of the best poetry derives its inspiration, its impact, from the strength of the emotions behind it. And few subjects seem to generate more passionate emotion than warfare.
Throughout the ages, war poetry has always been a political tool. It's always been about cultures in crisis.
The best of them are still extraordinarily moving, I think, and go on proving that down the generations. They have great strength and great delicacy. I mean, they really are, the best of them are masterpieces.
When we think about war poetry, one particular period stands out, the First World War. This is because during the years 1914 to 18, there was a tremendous outpouring of poetic expression that not only formed our ideas about the Great War, but changed the way we think about war forever. For the first time, poetry depicted the full horror of war, its inhumanity and ultimate pointlessness. This was a remarkable change because only half a century earlier, the poet laureate Alfred Lord Tennyson had written about the slaughter of an entire brigade during the Crimean War in heroic and almost celebratory terms. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. In fact, the tradition of describing the deeds of war in heroic terms goes back to the days when men fought battles on behalf of the gods. In the midst of all, divine Achilles, his fair person armed, his teeth gnashed as he stood, his eyes so full of fire they warmed unsuffered grief and anger at the Trojans so combined.
The fighting was eyeball to eyeball, and it called for great technical prowess on the part of the fighter. Had to be very athletic, and also great courage. And the role of the poet was to record the exploits of his own team, celebrating them and making their exploits memorable for the next generation.
Who doxa afflicata proston oranon, quod Xenos, the stranger.
The heroic deeds of the Greek warriors are still passed on at Rugby, one of England's most celebrated public schools, under the watchful eye of a former headmaster, the great Victorian educational reformer, Dr. Thomas Arnold.
He saw the first priority of his school and other such schools as educating managers of the empire. And to do that, he felt they needed to be educated in the history and ways of the previous major empire, notably the Roman Empire. So Latin became the principal subject of Rugby and other such schools, in the hope that they would go out to be proconsuls and centurions as successful as the Romans had been.
As the First World War loomed, Britain was eager for war and young men fought to enlist. As a result, while war service was compulsory in Germany, there was no conscription in Britain until 1916. Working class men saw the war as a patriotic adventure and an escape from humdrum lives. Intellectuals in the officer class saw the war in classical and chivalric terms, even as a picnic in uniform. And there was another reason for looking forward to battle. One of the most popular poems of the time compared war to cricket. The scene was set here on the rugby playing field known as the Close.
There's a breathless hush in the Close tonight, 10 to make and the match to win. A bumping pitch and a blinding light, an hour to play and the last man in. And it's not for the sake of a ribboned coat or the selfish hope of a season's fame, but his captain's hand on his shoulder smote, play up, and play the game. The sand of the desert is sodden red, red with the wreck of a square that broke. The Gatlings jammed and the colonel dead, and the regiment blind with dust and smoke. The river of death has brimmed his banks, and England's far and honour a name. But the voice of a schoolboy rallies the ranks, play up, and play the game.
The young poet Rupert Brooke drank deep from the sporting and classical tradition. He was a boarder in this house facing the Close, where his father was housemaster. His dashing good looks are captured on a plaque in the school chapel, and it's his youthful enthusiasm which captured the spirit of the opening days of the Great War.
Now God be thanked, who has matched us with his hour, and caught our youth, and wakened us from sleeping, with hand made sure, clear eye, and sharpened power, to turn, as swimmers into cleanness leaping, glad from a world grown old and cold and weary, leave the sick hearts that honour could not move.
In hindsight, Brooke's optimism was misplaced, and as a result, many people today look back on his poetry with mixed feelings.
I don't think Brooke is very much good as a poet. The war poems never will recover from, and it's not Brooke's fault this, but nevertheless they never will recover from seeming to say something about the war, which had Brooke lived he certainly would have revised, which is to say, those famous war sonnets do talk about going into war like being swimmers into cleanness leaping. No thanks.
Rupert Brooke never saw active service. He died en route to Gallipoli from a combination of sunstroke and blood poisoning. Nevertheless, his most famous poem, The Soldier, became immensely popular after it was read out here at St. Paul's Cathedral.
If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's, breathing English air, washed by her rivers, blessed by sons of home.
Famously, it should all have been over by Christmas, but as the war dragged on, both sides became literally more and more entrenched. In a war of attrition, huge forces were thrown into play for very little gain. The catastrophic Somme campaign of 1916 marked a watershed in the scale of the operation and of its human losses. Intellectuals like the poet Siegfried Sassoon began to have grave doubts about how the war was being conducted.
Good morning, the General said, when we met him last week on our way to the line. Now the soldiers he smiled at are most of them dead, and we're cursing his staff for incompetent swine. He's a cheery old card, grunted Harry to Jack as they slogged up to Arras with rifle and pack, but he did for them both by his plan of attack.
Before the war, Sassoon had led the life of a country squire. He combined a love of literature, cricket and blood sports with nights at the opera. He enjoyed ample private means. His poetry had already been published when he volunteered for the war at the age of 28, a decision that would change his life forever. After his first collection of poetry was published in 1917, Sassoon decided to go public with an explicit criticism of how the war was being conducted. I'm making this statement as an act of willful defiance of military authority, because I believe that the war is being deliberately prolonged by those who have the power to end it. I'm a soldier convinced that I'm acting on behalf of soldiers. I believe that this war, on which I entered as a war of defence and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. Sassoon should have been court-martialled and possibly even shot for his actions, but he was well enough connected to be placed instead in a hospital for victims of shell shock, Craiglockhart in Scotland. It was at Craiglockhart that one of the great poetic meetings of minds took place between the 31-year-old Sassoon and Wilfred Owen, a shy 24-year-old and still a relatively unformed poet. Subsequent Owen masterpieces, like Dulce et decorum est, owe a lot to Sassoon's influence. The title is taken from the most common memorial inscription of the time and means, "It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country." Owen attacked this sentiment when he described one of the greatest horrors of the trenches, a mustard gas attack.
Gas. Gas. Quick, boys. An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime. Dim through the misty panes and thick green light as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes riding in his face, his hanging face, like a devil's sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori.
Wilfred Owen was killed trying to lead his men across a canal in northern France. It was just 6 days before the armistice. The poetry of the First World War was predominantly written by officers, and indeed the only notable poet to emerge from the ranks was Isaac Rosenberg, a poor Russian Jew with little talent for soldiering but plenty for drawing, painting and poetry. The remains of his literary work have ended up at the Imperial War Museum in London.
These are fascinating as literary manuscripts because they say so much more than just the words that are on the paper. You've only got to look at the quality of what these are to see something about the life that the man was leading at the time that he was working on them. And it says a lot about conditions for an ordinary private soldier who was also a poet. Owen and Sassoon were officers. They had more time in which to write. And here was Rosenberg in the front line, 22 months in the front line with one 10-day leave, that was all. And all his work was done in terrible conditions of being a private. And you can see the quality of the paper on which he was working. Folded, folded again, wet, muddy, pencil, appalling conditions. He said at one time that from October 1916 till May 1917 he'd been able to write just 70 lines.
Sombre the night is, and though we have our lives, we know what sinister threat lurks there. Dragging these anguished limbs, we only know this poison-blasted track opens on our camp, on a little safe sleep. But hark! Joy, joy, strange joy. Lo, heights of night ringing with unseen larks, music showering our upturned listening faces. Death could drop from the dark as easily as song, but song only dropped, like a blind man's dreams on the sand by dangerous tides, like a girl's dark hair, for she dreams no ruin lies there, or her kisses where a serpent hides.
The theme that comes out of his war poetry, the time and again, is beauty. The song of the lark, the joy falling from the skies. He was living in appalling conditions, and yet this was the thing that obsessed him. These are not the result of a man writing about disillusionment, partly because he went into the war with no illusions to shed.
Like so many other First World War poets, Isaac Rosenberg was killed in action and died on the 1st of April 1918. After the First World War, the enormous sense of anguish that people felt about the human cost of the conflict had a strangely neutralising effect on criticism of the way that the war was conducted. People simply wanted to forget. By the 30s, the increasingly polarised ideologies of the left and right brought new causes to fight for. Initially in Spain, where the legitimate left-wing government was under threat from the right-wing rebels led by General Franco. Helping embattle Spain became a rally call for the idealistic young, including writers like Arthur Koestler, Laurie Lee and George Orwell. Another young recruit was Stephen Spender, later to become poet laureate.
One thought one might write, at least I thought I might write, a kind of poetry about the ideas which were involved in the revolution and the vision of a better society and so on. People have always wanted to do this. I mean, it goes back to Shelley, really. And I did try and write a few poems of this sort. I can't think that any of them were at all successful, but I did try. The guns spell money's ultimate reason in letters of lead on the spring hillside. But the boy, lying dead under the olive trees, was too young and too silly to have been notable to their important eye. He was a better target for a kiss. When he lived, tall factory hooters never summoned him, nor did restaurant plate glass doors revolve to wave him in. His name never appeared in the papers. The world maintained its traditional wall round the dead with their gold sunk deep as a well, whilst his life, intangible as a stock exchange rumour, drifted outside.
The idealists' passionate involvement in the Spanish Civil War proved fruitless. General Franco was victorious, and the larger European war that many had been predicting now seemed inevitable. When the Second World War was eventually declared in 1939, enthusiasm for all things military was tempered by memories of what had happened on the Western Front, and poets too faced the future in a less romantic frame of mind. Instead of the drama of the Western Front, most conscripts were sent to training camps, where, like the poet Henry Reed, they experienced the tedium of military instruction.
Today, we have naming of parts. Yesterday we had daily cleaning, and tomorrow morning we shall have what to do after firing. But today we have naming of parts. Japonica glistens like coral in all of the neighboring gardens. And today we have naming of parts. This is the lower sling swivel, and this is the upper sling swivel, whose use you will see when you are given your slings. And this is the piling swivel, which in your case you have not got. The branches hold in the gardens their silent, eloquent gestures, which in our case we have not got.
A lot of Second World War poetry is about sort of being in the army, or anecdotes about the army, or the sort of grimness of the routine and sort of in the bureaucracy and sort of so on. And when it came to the actual fighting, if it ever did, which in a lot of cases it didn't, then this was a highly mechanized sort of thing. So with a poet like Keith Douglas, he's in a tank. Well, he's the nearest anybody got to, sort of riding a horse. I mean, as in that poem Aristocrats, that where he does sort of hark back almost nostalgically and yet pityingly to a period when you could ride into battle on a horse, and you could entertain these heroic fantasies.
How can I live among this gentle, obsolescent breed of heroes and not weep?
A bright gleam has caught the helmet.
Unicorns, almost, for they are fading into two legends in which their stupidity and chivalry are celebrated. Each fool and hero will be an immortal. These plains were their cricket pitch, and in the mountains the tremendous drop fences brought down some of the runners. Here then, under the stones and earth, they disposed themselves. I think, with their famous unconcern, it is not gunfire I hear, but a hunting horn.
Keith Douglas is extraordinarily tough, amazingly precocious, with a fantastically impressive mixture in his language of what is braced up, alert, and at the same time very nearly conversational, very nearly relaxed, very little ostentatious about it. These are marvellous poems, and do feel as though they could have been written yesterday, actually. And they really are about their period, but have a poetic language which has proved to be essentially the poetic language which people continue to use right up until now.
When the Second World War ended in 1945, the appalling destruction at Hiroshima and Nagasaki gave the war its metaphorical conclusion. But for the following 40 years, the world lived in constant fear of global holocaust.
All autumn, the chafe and jar of nuclear war. We have talked our extinction to death. I swim like a minnow behind my studio window. Our end drifts nearer. The moon lifts, radiant with terror. The state is a diver under a glass bell. A father's no shield for his child. We are like a lot of wild spiders crying together, but without tears.
One of the commentators on what came to be known as the Beat Generation very famously said of the dropping of the bombs in Japan that we're the first generation who have grown up with the possibility that our death could also be at the same moment that the whole world is destroyed. And I think that sensibility runs right through the writing and the poetry of the post-war American generation.
From the moment the perversely named Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima, we have lived under the threat of a global nuclear holocaust. But the Third World War hasn't happened yet. Instead, there have been hundreds of brutal, localized wars all over the world. In 1964, the USA went to war in Vietnam. It was the beginning of the most traumatic period in American military history.
As American casualties in Vietnam rise, so does the number of American servicemen held prisoner in North Vietnam.
I was run over by the truth one day. Ever since the accident, I've walked this way. So stick my legs in plaster. Tell me lies about Vietnam. Heard the alarm clock screaming with pain. Couldn't find myself, so I went back to sleep again. So fill my ears with silver, stick my legs in plaster, tell me lies about Vietnam.
In a broadcast last night, President Johnson said that all American peace moves had been rebuffed and that he had ordered the resumption of air attacks.
That whole question of lies and being lied to, and that the truth has become so complex, one's reality has become so complex, that you can no longer trust anyone in authority. I think that's a general sense of what was going on in the 60s, or that reflects a general sense of what was going on in the 60s. But I think it is put to particular use by poets like Adrian Mitchell.
Where were you at the time of the crime? Down by the cenotaph, drinking slime. So chain my tongue with whiskey, stuff my nose with garlic, coat my eyes with butter, fill my ears with silver, stick my legs in plaster, tell me lies about Vietnam.
Post-60s poetry is different because of the advent of pop music and so on. It's a sort of mass chant or anthem, aspiring really to the condition of John Lennon, sort of, I think. And that would be the ideal thing, a mass audience where you could boom out, I don't want there to be a war, and sort of make like that was a line of poetry, sort of, and because they'd all cheer and be really glad you said that because they agree with that. And that isn't poetry for me.
Nowadays, a soldier is more likely to write his memoirs or a novel about his war experiences than poetry. Poetry doesn't seem to have the same appeal to artists as it did in the days when the survival of the empire or of the country itself depended on everyone doing their bit. The recent British-American campaign in the Gulf was a very media-conscious war, and the Guardian newspaper sent the poet Tony Harrison to comment.
It became, I think, pretty apparent early on in the Gulf War they were going to keep the media well back, certainly in the early stages. And so it was a war that was initially covered almost entirely through official briefings. And I think it was the first war in which you had this kind of, you know, the pin sights and the bombs going down chimney stacks.
The pilot scores a direct hit.
It was really trying to find a different way of writing about this war, and I think that's where the idea came to me that maybe a poet could say things that commentators and reporters couldn't.
I saw the charred Iraqi lean towards me from bomb-blasted screen, his windscreen wiper like a pen, ready to write down thoughts for men, his windscreen wiper like a quill he's reaching for to make his will. I saw the charred Iraqi lean like someone made of plasticine, as though he'd stopped to ask the way, and this is what I heard him say. Don't be afraid, I've picked on you for this exclusive interview. Isn't it your sort of poet's task to find words for this frightening mask? If that gadget that you've got records words from such scorched vocal cords, press record before some dog devours me mid-monologue. So I held the shaky microphone closer to the crumbling bone.
I think he is trying to make poetry relevant, and he's doing that by appealing to a popular imagination. But I think there's depth. Partly, I think, because he knows the classics. He's read Homer and Virgil.
Poetry can say things with much greater effect than newspapers or television ever can, and unfortunately there are enough conflicts raging around the world to keep the poets inspired. Here at the Imperial War Museum, people can imagine themselves in control of some death-dealing piece of machinery, but the museum itself likes to make visitors of all ages more thoughtful about war. A new scheme is the Kids Poetry Hunt, in which pieces of poetry are hidden in unexpected places around the exhibits. Here it's a fragment of Isaac Rosenberg.
We heard his very last sound, and our wheels grazed his dead face.
Most children have no experience of war, but they still catch the power and intensity of those words. That's the terrible beauty of war poetry. It eloquently encapsulates human experiences that we can't even imagine.
Isaac Rosenberg, May 14th, 1917.
We wanted a